I have previously pointed out that the difference between traditional and modern man is not simply a matter of mentality and type of civilization. Rather, the difference concerns the experiential possibilities available to each and the way in which the world of nature is experienced according to the categories of perception and the fundamental relationship between the I and not I. For traditional man, space, time, and causality had a very different character than they have in the experience of modern man. The mistake of epistemology from Kant on is to assume that these fundamental forms of human experience have always remained the same, especially those with which we are most familiar in recent times. On the contrary, even in this aspect, it is possible to notice a deep transformation that reflects the general involutive process at work in history. With this said, I will limit myself to discussing the difference in the perception of space and time. As I mentioned in the foreword, my main contention is that time in traditional civilizations was not a linear, historical time. Time and becoming are related to what is superior to time. In this way, the perception of time undergoes a spiritual transformation. In order to clarify this point, it is necessary to explain what time means today. Time is perceived as the simple, irreversible order of consecutive events. Its parts are mutually homogeneous and therefore can be measured in a quantitative fashion. Moreover, a distinction is made between before and later, namely between past and future, in reference to a totally relative, the present point in time. But whether an event is past or future, whether it makes place in one or another point in time, does not confer upon it any special quality. It merely makes it a datable event. That's all. In other words, there is some kind of reciprocal indifference between time and its contents. The temporality of these contents simply means that they are carried along by a continuous current that never inverts its course, and in which every moment, while being different from all others, is also equal to all others. In the most recent scientific theories, such as Minkowski's and Einstein's, time even loses this particular character. Scientists talk about the relativity of time as space's fourth dimension, and so on. This means that time becomes a mathematical order per se that is absolutely indifferent with regard to events, which may thus be located in a before rather than in an after, depending on the reference system being adopted. The traditional experience of time was of a very different kind. Time was not regarded quantitatively, but rather qualitatively, not as a series, but as a rhythm. It did not flow uniformly and indefinitely, but was broken down into cycles and periods in which every moment had its own meaning and specific value in relation to all others, as well as a lively individuality and functionality. Each of these cycles or periods, the Chaldean and Hellenic Great Year, the Etruscan or Latin Saeculum, the Iranian Aeon, the Aztec Suns, and the Hindu Kalpas, represented a complete development, forming closed and perfect units that were identical to each other. Although they reoccurred, they did not change, nor did they multiply, but rather followed each other according to Hubert Mause's fitting expression as a series of eternities. Since this wholeness was not quantitative but organic, the chronological duration of the saeculum was ephemeral. Quantitatively different periods of time were regarded as equal, provided that each of them contained and reproduced all the typical phases of a cycle. And so, certain numbers such as 7, 9, 12, and 1000 were traditionally employed not to express quantities but rather typical structures of rhythm. Thus, they had different durations, though they remain symbolically equivalent. Accordingly, instead of an indefinite chronological sequence, the traditional world knew a hierarchy based on analogical correspondences between great and small cycles. The result was a sort of reduction of the temporal manifold to the supertemporal unity, since the small cycle reproduced analogically the great cycle. This created the possibility of participation in ever greater orders and in durations increasingly free from all residues of matter or contingency, until what was reached was some kind of space continuum. By ordering time from above so that every duration was divided into several cyclical periods reflecting such a structure, and by associating to specific moments of these cycles the celebrations, rituals, or festivities that were destined to reawaken or to reveal the corresponding meanings, the traditional world actively promoted a liberation and a transfiguration. It arrested the confused flow of the waters and created in them a transparency in the current of becoming, thus revealing immovable metaphysical depths. Therefore, it should not come as a surprise that the base calendar that measured time in ancient times had a sacred character, and that it was entrusted to the wisdom of the priestly castes, and that the hours of the day, the days of the week, and given days of the year were considered sacred to certain deities or associated with specific destinies. After all, as a residue of this notion, Catholicism developed a liturgical year spangled with religious festivities and with days marked by sacred events. In this liturgical year, we can still find an echo of that ancient view of time that was measured by ritual, transfigured by the symbol, and shaped into the image of a sacred history. The fact that stars, stellar periods, and given points in the course of the sun were traditionally utilized to determine the units of rhythm hardly lent support to the so-called naturalistic interpretations of time. In fact, the traditional world never deified the natural or heavenly elements, but on the contrary, these elements were thought fit to convey divine forces in an analogical fashion. There is in the heavens a great multitude of gods who have been recognized as such by those who survey the heavens not casually nor like cattle. Therefore, we can assume that the position of the sun in the course of the year was primordially the center and the beginning of an organic system, of which the calendar notation was just another aspect, that established constant interferences and symbolical and magical correspondences between man, cosmos, and the supernatural reality. The two arches of the ascent and the descent of the solar light during the year appear to be the most apt to express the sacrificial meaning of death and rebirth, as well as the cycle constituted by the dark descending path and by the bright ascending path. I will discuss later the tradition according to which the area that today corresponds to the Arctic regions was the original homeland of the stock that created the main Indo-European civilizations. It is possible that when the Arctic freeze occurred, the division of the year into one long night and one long day highly dramatized the perception of the sun's journey in the sky, and thus made it one of the best ways to express the above-mentioned metaphysical meanings, substituting them with what was referred to in more remote periods as pure, though not yet solar, polar symbolism. Considering that the constellations of the zodiac, which were articulations of the God year, were used to identify the moments of the sun's position in the sky, the number 12 is repeatedly found as one of the most apt rhythms to express anything that may have the meaning of a solar fulfillment. This number is also found wherever a center was established that in one way or another embodied or attempted to embody the Uranian solar tradition, or wherever myths or legends have portrayed the type of an analogous regency through figurations or symbolical personifications. But in the course of the solar journey along the 12 points of the zodiac, one point in particular acquires a special meaning, and that is the critical one corresponding to the lowest point on the ellipsis, winter solstice, the sign of Capricorn, which marks the end of the descent, the beginning of the rescent, and the separation of the dark and the bright periods. According to the figurations formulated in remote prehistory, the God year is portrayed in the context as the axe, or as the god axe, who splits in half the circular symbol of the year, or other equivalent symbols. From a spiritual perspective, this marks the typical triumphant moment of solarity and the beginning of a new life and of a new cycle, natalis dissolis invicti. This moment was represented in various myths as the victorious outcome of the struggle of a solar hero against creatures manifesting the dark principle. These creatures were often represented by the sign of the zodiac in which the winter solstice happened to fall in that particular year. The dates corresponding to stellar positions in the sky, such as the solstice, which were apt to express higher meanings in terms of a cosmic symbolism, are preserved almost identically in the various forms assumed by tradition and passed on from one people to another. Through a comparative study, it is possible and very easy to point out the correspondence and the uniformity of feasts and of fundamental calendar rhythms through which the sacred was introduced into the fabric of time, thus breaking its duration into many cyclical images of an eternal history that various natural phenomena contributed to recall and to mark the rhythm. In the traditional view, moreover, time presented a magical aspect, since by virtue of the law of analogical correspondences, every point of a cycle had its own individuality. Duration consisted in the periodical succession of manifestations typical of certain influences and powers. It presented times that were favorable and unfavorable, auspicious and inauspicious. This qualitative element of time played the main role in the science of the rite. The parts of time could not be considered indifferent to the things to be performed, and thus presented an active character that had to be reckoned with. Every rite had its own appointed time. It had to be performed at a particular moment, outside of which its virtue was diminished or paralyzed, and could even produce the opposite effect. In many ways, we can agree with Hubert Maus, who said that the ancient calendar marked the periodicity of a system of rites. More generally, there were disciplines such as the science of divination that attempted to establish whether a given time or period was auspicious or not for the performance of a given deed. I have already mentioned the attention given to this matter in Roman military enterprises. This is not fatalism. It rather expresses traditional man's constant intent to to prolong and to integrate his own strength with a non-human strength by discovering the times in which two rhythms, the human rhythm and the rhythm of natural powers, by virtue of a law of syntony, of a concordant action, and of a certain correspondence between the physical and the metaphysical dimensions, are liable to become one thing, and thus cause invisible powers to act. In this way, the qualitative view of time is confirmed. Within time, every hour and every aspect has its sacred aspect and its virtue, also acting within time on the higher symbolical and sacral plane. There are cyclical laws that actualize in an identical fashion an uninterrupted chain of eternity. The considerations that follow from these premises are very important. If traditionally, empirical time was measured by a transcendent time that did not contain events but meanings, and if this essentially metahistorical time must be considered as the context in which myths, heroes, and traditional gods lived and acted, then an opposite shift acting from below must also be conceived. In other words, it is possible that some historically real events or people may have repeated and dramatized a myth, incarnating meta-historical structures and symbols, whether in part or entirely, whether consciously or unconsciously. Thereupon, by virtue of this, these events or beings shift from one time to the other, becoming new expressions of pre-existent realities. They belong to both times. They are characters and events that are simultaneously real and symbolical. And on this basis, they can be transported from one period to another, before or after their real existence, as long as one is aware of the metahistorical element they represent. This is the reason why some of the findings of modern scholars concerning the alleged historicity of events or characters of the traditional world, much of their obsession to separate what is historical from what is mythical or legendary, some of their doubts about the childish traditional chronology, and finally their belief in so-called euhemerism, can most decisively be said to lack solid foundations. In these cases, as I have previously argued, myth and anti-history represent the path leading to a deeper knowledge of what we regard as history. Moreover, it is in this same order of ideas that we must look for the true meaning of the legends concerning characters who become invisible, who never died, and who are destined to reawaken, or to manifest themselves at the end of a given time, cyclical correspondence, such as Alexander the Great, King Arthur, Frederick, King Sebastian. The latter are all different incarnations of the same one theme transferred from reality into super reality. The Hindu doctrine of the avatars, the periodical divine incarnations who assume different personalities but who nevertheless express the same function, must be interpreted along these lines. If traditional man had an experience of time essentially different from that of modern man, it follows that analogous considerations must be made concerning the experience of space. Space is considered today as the simple container of bodies and of motions, totally indifferent to both. It is homogeneous. A particular area of it is the objective equivalent of another one, and the fact that a thing is found or that an event may take place in one point of space rather than in another does not confer any particular quality to the intimate nature of that thing or of that event. I am referring here to what space represents in the immediate experience of modern man, and not to certain recent physical mathematical views of space as a curved and non-homogeneous, multi-dimensional space. Moreover, beside the fact that these are mere mathematical schemata, the value of which is merely pragmatic and without correspondence to any real experience, The different values that the points of each of these spaces represent, when considered as intensive fields, are referred only to matter, energy, and gravitation, and not to something extra-physical or qualitative. In the experience of traditional man, on the contrary, and even in its residues at times present among some savage populations, space is alive and saturated with all kinds of qualities and intensity. The traditional idea of space is often confused with the same idea of vital ether, the akasha or mana, which is a mystical, all-pervasive substance energy, more material than immaterial, more psychic than physical, often conceived as light and distributed according to various saturations in various regions. Thus, each of these regions seems to possess its own virtues and to participate essentially in the powers that reside in it, so as to make every place a fatidic space endowed with its own intensity and occult individuality. In the well-known expression of Epimenides of Knossos, 6th century BC, that was quoted by Paul in his speech in the Areopagus, "In him we live and move and have our being." Acts 17:28. If we substitute for the word him the word divine or sacred or numinous, it may be employed to express what traditional man often saw instead of the space of the moderns, which is ultimately an abstract and impersonal place filled with objects and motions. It is not possible in this context to discuss all of what in the traditional world was based on such an experience of space. I will limit myself to references in the two distinct orders mentioned above, namely the magical and the symbolical. Space in antiquity has constantly provided the basis for the most characteristic expressions of the metaphysical dimension. The heavenly and the earthly regions, high and low, the vertical and the horizontal axis, left and right, were all categories that provided the material for a typical, highly significant and universal symbolism, one of the most famous forms of which was the symbolism of the cross. There may well have been a relationship between the two-dimensional cross and the four cardinal points, between the tri-dimensional cross and the scheme derived by adding to these points the dimensions of above and below. Still, this does not lend any support whatsoever to the naturalistic and geoastronomical interpretations of ancient symbols. At this point, it is helpful to repeat what has been said concerning the astral element of the calendars, namely that when the cross is found in nature, this means that true symbolism, far from being artificially devised by man, is found in nature itself. Or better, nature in its entirety is nothing but a symbol of transcendent realities. When we shift to the magical plane, every direction in space corresponded to given influences that were often portrayed as supernatural beings or as spirits. This knowledge not only helped to establish important aspects of the augural science and of geomancy, see the characteristic development of this discipline in the Far East, but also the doctrine of the sacred orientations in the rite and the arrangement of the temples. The art of orientation of the cathedrals was preserved in Europe up to the Middle Ages. Always conformity with the law of analogies and with the possibility afforded by this law to extend the human and the visible element into the cosmic and invisible dimension. Just as one moment of traditional time did not correspond to another because of the action, especially a ritual one, that had to be undertaken, likewise there was not a point, a region, or a place of traditional space that corresponded to another. This was the case in an even wider sense owing to the fact that some rites required subterranean places or caves, while others required mountains, peaks, and so on. In fact, there was such a thing as a real, that is, not arbitrary, but conformed to physical transpositions of metaphysical elements, sacred geography that inspired the belief in sacred lands and cities, in the traditional centers of spiritual influence on earth, and also in environments consecrated so as to vitalize any action oriented to the transcendence taking place within them. Generally speaking, in the world of tradition, the location of the temples and the many cities was not casual, nor did it obey simple criteria of convenience. Their construction was preceded by specific rites and obeyed special laws of rhythm and of analogy. It is very easy to identify those elements that indicate that the space in which the traditional rite took place was not space as modern man understands it, but rather a living, fatidic, magnetic space in which every gesture had a meaning, and in which every sign, word, and action participated in a sense of ineluctability and of eternity, thus becoming transformed into a kind of decree of the invisible. And yet, the space in which the rite occurs should be regarded as a more intense kind of space in the general perception of the man of tradition.